And I'm going to talk a little bit, maybe a lot, not so much about this mission stuff, because Lars covered it very nicely, I think, in terms of where it's come from and where it is at this point. And suffice to say, a lot of my work at Vinnova is about these new mission approaches, one way or another. But also implicit in what Lars was saying is that, let's put it like this, many countries around the world are now interested in mission-oriented innovation because the idea of the moonshot is returning, but this time applied to things like climate change or health or inequality, these so-called wicked problems that we can't tackle using the same instruments that created those problems. So we can't solve climate change really using the same tools that created climate change. So clearly there's an issue we have to resolve there. And using the moonshot as an example around a national mission to achieve a very bold and tangible outcome within a time frame with measurable results, with lots of economic spillover, by the way, as you probably all know the stories about the moonshot and all of the things from Teflon through to new types of fabrics that came out of that process. As Lars also points out, there was a very, actually, it wasn't simple, but it was a technological agenda. And now we have these very complex ones. So many places are interested, cities, governments, Sweden, Vinnova included. What we have to do, though, is kind of glue that very big top-down agenda to then what happens on the ground. What kind of projects are we doing, in what way? And maybe I'll talk a little bit about that stuff now, as opposed to the big picture. Let's assume that we can motivate people around climate change and health. Then the question is to do what and how. So I'll talk a little bit about that, which is really more about systems-based innovation and so on. And with technology in mind, because it's kind of always there, like a bad smell or a good smell, depending on your point of view. I always like to start with this perspective that we have to assume it's involved, but we need to handle it very carefully because it has huge impact. So we need to ask, what's the question first? Then we can talk about the tech. And that isn't often the way we do it, as you know, as humans. We sort of like to jump on something that looks like a solution, and then we go all in on that, and then it turns out it has unintended consequences. And Cedric Price was a British architect in the 1960s who said this at that point, 1965 actually, and we don't really still think about that enough. He was probably talking primarily about the motor car as the tech of the time, if you like. The kind of Google equivalent would have been Ford, I guess, or Volvo here. And many people took a series of decisions quite quickly sometimes, which then have a huge impact. You can see a city like Los Angeles, if you've ever watched Who Framed Roger Rabbit, or you know the history, removed what was the largest tram system in the world in about 2 or 3 years in the late 50s. I mean, it was bigger in LA than anywhere else. The second biggest was in Sydney. That was also taken out within about 2 or 3 years with this bet on the motor car. And that decision, taken very quickly actually, by well-meaning people and experts, has what, like a 200-year impact? I don't know. I mean, the impact of building those freeways through the middle of cities is multi-generational. And we see the same in Stockholm, of course. It's not like we didn't also do that. We didn't do it in quite the way LA did, but still you can see the impact of those decisions. Nonetheless, technology is interesting. It's just what we do with it and how. So when we look at, this is an autonomous vehicle in Helsinki, a little shuttle bus driving around Helsinki now. That's not a real-time video. I'm not that good. It's a video. But there are autonomous shuttles on the public transport network in Helsinki. They've been testing them for several years now, one way or another. They exist. They're here and now. If you go to California now, you'll see them tootling around, the Waymo ones. The interesting question there is in those big numbers, whether it's MIT or ETH in Zurich, I guess maybe Coteha's researchers already looking at the same kind of thing as well. What would be the impact of a shared autonomous fleet, let's say buses, it's because they are just buses basically, on cities? It could be profound if we wanted it to. You know, you could potentially remove up to 70–80% of private car use, potentially. The real number is somewhere less than that, of course. The number for Stockholm will be less than, those numbers are based on Singapore and New York and Zurich region. So Zurich region, not that dissimilar to Stockholm in a sense, but what's the number there is an interesting question. And it's really a question of not this will happen inevitably, it's a question of what do we want it to be. So again, the tech could potentially get us there if we decided to do it. And I think sometimes people feel like technology is like this wave that's coming and we have to just react to it and absorb it. And in actual fact, we have all kinds of choices. But my point here is imagine you could remove 70-80% of the private cars from a city like Stockholm. The amount of space alone that would save, that you could do other things with. Never mind the reduction in carbon, increase in air quality, reduction in accidents and so on. Just looking at it as a potential. Then the question is, okay, how much? Is it 80%? No, it's probably 40%, or it might be 20% or 2% to begin with, but that's a different conversation. Super local microgrids. This is an Australian project in Perth, actually, which is just a little neighborhood block. They generate all the energy on the roof, and it's all stored in the basement in batteries. So, notwithstanding issues around lithium in the batteries and other rare metals, interesting. It's not part of the grid, national grid, or the city grid. It's self-sufficient in that sense. Now, we're sort of used to thinking about off-grid in like a summer house in the forest by a lake. But this is now happening in a city. So what does that mean? Do they pay taxes into the city because those taxes subsidize the grid network in some way or not? In question. Also, there's a social dimension to this. If this energy is coming from the roof, we're sharing it across the block. They actually use the blockchain to handle the transactions, totally unnecessarily, in my view. That's using you could just build some software. You don't have to use the blockchain for that. But anyway, blockchain probably uses more energy than you're saving. Anyway, it's interesting because you sort of think, well, let's say Thomas wants to watch the Champions League tonight. I've got some spare kilowatts. We have some spare kilowatts collectively. Go for it. But say that I annoyed Thomas in some way. I made a terrible pasta last week. Does he share his energy with me in that or not? I don't know. There's a social dimension because we've now made it super local. Previously, you sort of flick the switch there, and I guess not many, maybe in this room, some people do know where the energy comes from because it's côté hard, but most people would not know where the energy comes from that's powering this room. It's from kilometers away, probably. It could be a nuclear power station, could be hydroelectric, I have no idea. Now we're saying it's on my roof and it's going to you, or it's on your roof and coming to me. So who designs this system? This isn't an engineering problem, it's also a sociology problem, simultaneously in that sense. Housing is also then sociology, clearly. Cooperative housing is super interesting. In Berlin and Zurich, it's now an increasingly large part of the housing stock. Something like 27% of all new housing in Zurich is cooperative mode. So this is without a property developer. Sorry if there's any developers in the room. I'm not being mean. I'm just saying this is happening. Nightingale in Melbourne is a very good example of this as well. It's because there's no property developer, it's 25% cheaper right away. So it's just, okay, you guys decide to make a house together. You take out a mortgage collectively. There's still an architect and an engineer. There's just without the developer's margin in there. So you spend that money somewhere else or you make it cheaper, whatever. It tends to be more sustainable because people, if they're involved in the design, make sustainable choices usually because they're the ones paying the energy bills. So of course you put solar cells on the roof. In a property developer model, you're not really incentivized to do that necessarily because you're not going to be paying those costs. They reduce their mobility needs. They share a car because digging a garage under a building is super expensive and you don't want to have to do that unnecessarily and so on. The architecture is more interesting actually when people are involved from an architectural point of view. You get all these kind of interesting quirks and it's because it's built around real people. You mentioned Carlo. Carlo's working on this autonomous ferry for Amsterdam, which is logistics. So this can stack together and move people sometimes or goods. Obviously, Amsterdam is half water in some bits, so of course they think like that. Stockholm has also had a lot of water in it, actually. So this is kind of interesting because it's quiet, potentially safe, could happen at night, doesn't need lights in a way, links to other forms of fabrication. Different types of building are available in this way, different types of decision making and so on. So my point here is we have a lot of things we can use. In a way, I'd say these big challenges are not technological challenges, so they're not like the moonshot in that sense, where we had to do a lot of raw new tech. We have a lot of solutions in front of us. The questions really are ownership and politics and culture, social relationships, those kinds of things, which is interesting from an innovation system point of view, because the innovation system has skewed towards the tech and science and engineering end of it traditionally. And actually it turns out, well, maybe the big problems are social, cultural, economic, and ownership and governance questions. So that's a challenge for us at Vinnova. How do we make sure this is properly holistic? To make this very tangible, this is the impact of Uber and Lyft on traffic speed in a big city like New York. This is not talking about Uber and Lyft's other impacts. And again, not being nasty about either of them, because car sharing is clearly a good thing. It's just how you do it is a massive difference from place to place. So from a system point of view, actually Uber looks like a machine for putting more cars on the road. Despite the rhetoric, it actually creates congestion. There's 25,000 Ubers in London on a Friday night, just in the middle, because it's sort of incentivized drivers to get out of there. That's why it works from an individual point of view. If you pull out your phone in your pocket now and look up Uber, you'll find magically there's a car 2 minutes away. How does that happen? That's because they're incentivizing drivers onto the road. So while it's great for the individual, and it's pretty good for Uber, clearly, it's terrible for the city. It's sort of at scale, collectively, it then becomes a huge problem. So how does a city manage that? Cities don't have R&D teams traditionally, not in the way that Uber has an R&D team. It's kind of an uneven battle in that sense. So we absolutely have to do the kind of work that Viable Cities and others are doing to shore up this kind of capability to look ahead and then say, okay, we need to decide as a city, how do we want to move around? You can see cities beginning to do this. This is a quote from Jean-Louis Misca, the Deputy Mayor of Paris. The bit in red, I guess, if you can see that, is relevant. He said last summer, or the summer before, we should announce before 2020 that in Paris, no privately owned autonomous vehicle will be allowed. It's only mobility as a service. So that's a politician talking, and with all due respect, that means it's a long way from policy and regulation and action necessarily. But at the same time, isn't it interesting that a deputy mayor stood up and said that? And he's kind of provoking the question. We as Parisians need to understand how would we like to move around as Parisians. If we don't do that, then Mercedes-Benz or Tesla or Google will do it for us. So, and they will have a very different impact logic, to use the Vinnova language. So Lars won't be able to drive his privately owned Tesla or be driven by his autonomous Tesla into the middle of Paris. It'll be a taxi bot, a shared service, in Jean-Louis Misca's view. Question is, so how do we engage people in that kind of stuff? So let me talk about a couple of angles here. One project we did with Ericsson, not to do with mobility, was just looking at tools for engaging the public. So this was saying that the model is a good thing, a planning model is fun, but what if you had an augmented reality layer on top of it, which would show the impact of the decision? So if the block is turned round, it gets less sunlight on it than it was in the previous mode. So maybe you plant potatoes on it instead of tomatoes. Or you put solar cells or you don't put solar cells. We don't really have these kinds of toolkits that enable us then to have the conversation Jean-Louis Misca wants us to have. What would be the impact of mobility if we took the parking away? So how do we create the right tool for that? I'm not suggesting this is an answer, by the way. This is prototyping and testing. It doesn't exist. It kind of exists. But it's suggesting what would be a tool to use where we can have a social conversation around a table in a pub or in here. And we also have the data to hand, and it shows us the impact, and we can talk that through together. To make that a bit more real, Ericsson R&D then did do some work with UN Habitat. We were part of this a little bit. We did the previous thing, and we were part of this too. Working in Johannesburg with Wits University there, looking at building a model of the city which kind of existed, and then they worked with Minecraft to make the model in Minecraft, which is a Swedish company, interestingly. And then engage citizens in how would you modify this environment. So then they work with school kids to build the modifications in Minecraft, because that was a natural tool to use for them actually, very fluid. Minecraft is actually really good because it's kind of low resolution. You don't get worried about the high res, but it's got properties in it. And then they built a tool where you could hold up your phone and go outside and then look at your Minecraft modifications overlaid onto the street around you. So this was the next iteration of the thing I showed you previously. Again, augmented reality. I'm not saying these things should be built, by the way. Clearly some of these ideas are terrible. But what we found in this process that people began to see this is my city. I have a voice here in some way. I can propose things for it. We can have a conversation around it, and then we can have a trade-offs. We can start talking about the decision. What if we did this, or what if we did this? And I can do that in a situated way out there where I can see it. It's not an architect's plan or a section, which is really hard to read, even if you're an architect sometimes. But it's something that people are sort of already used to. And the impact is amazing, actually, if you can... You can kind of just hear the sort of delight of just seeing this. I proposed that, and that changed there, and it's simple as that. So it's... we need those tools. We need these projects to make these kinds of tools, because we need different types of conversations happening. So let me show you another thing. That's about what can we change. Now, what you can change has fast and slow impact. Putting a highway through the middle of a city, as I said previously, is a big change, slow thing. Once you put it in there, you can't move it for 100 years, probably, maybe 50 if we're lucky. You can change the street, though, very quickly in other ways. And all of the modifications they were testing were, what if we did this and this and this, kind of small acupunctures. So switching to Melbourne, we did a project there that Lars knows a bit about for the Innovation District. There's lots of streets in Melbourne that look like this, actually super wide. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or 7 lanes across. So wide you can have parking in the middle of the street as well as at the edges on both sides. There's tons of roads like that in Melbourne. There's actually quite a few of them in Stockholm, but anyway. So we looked at that as, well, how would you change this thing? So have a mission in mind, as Lars said. We might have a mission to make the air cleaner and the carbon emissions lower, increase the tree cover, reduce the stormwater impact, increase business rates while making kids healthier. Those are all outcomes, 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 outcomes. And I'm going to say, let's have the conversation about the outcomes. And I don't know how we're going to get there. This is then the hard bit from a traditional governance and planning point of view. I'm not going to promise I know all of the steps, because some of them are by definition unknown, have to be. And also we don't know what the impact of them will be until we try some of them. But we could have this conversation about the outcomes. Do you want your kids healthier or less healthy? Do you want pollution up or down, And then by how much would we like, okay? So the first thing we start doing is we start building a system to test the impact one way or another, using sensors in this case. Doesn't have to be sensors, you could do it in lots of ways, but let's say we stick in a Wi-Fi, free public Wi-Fi and sensor totem there, and one here as well, and we announce what those things are, and we do that in preserving privacy, doing it ethically. Those are very important details of execution. Then, I don't know if you saw that, but the parking here, what if we angle the parking on the left-hand side there? If we angle the parking, we can get double the cars on the left, which means we can free up space for a bike lane here. We still, in some way, we might have reduced the parking by 10%, but there's still a lot of parking there. You can still drive down both sides. But we're already beginning to test this bike lane. And a bike lane, by the way, is some paint. You can test it and untest it when you're done with it if you wanted to, but it becomes an intervention. In reality, we know when bike lanes go in, they tend not to come back out because they tend to be used. But we need to at least start with something in this way. I deliberately didn't put a helmet on the guy to really annoy people in Australia because it's against the law. So you can even use these drawings to suggest, wouldn't it be nice if people could cycle without helmets? Open question. Obviously, many people in the room will be thinking, you're crazy. Helmets are a good thing. Half the room is thinking, of course. But this immediately gets you into that discussion, right? Then let's try one of these autonomous shuttle thingos that we saw in Helsinki. They exist in the world. Okay, we can try one. We can figure out how much it costs and do a trial. We're not going to go at scale across the whole city yet. Let's see if it works. So we have a rideshare pickup point here now, because then we want to concentrate the pickup at certain points. Let's have that conversation as well. Floating bikes and scooters can't just go everywhere, actually. They probably should be concentrated a little bit. So that's an interesting technical question as well. But let's do it as a trial and make it visible. Okay, now let's plant some planters here. We've got a bike share hub here. We can begin to increase the kind of tree cover a bit and the foliage. We're borrowing back bits of street. But you see, we're doing this bit by bit. This isn't closing down the whole road and an engineering project for 2 years. All of these adjustments are kind of small iterative steps. However, we could get to this point where we make the big move, potentially, where we start talking about a shared surface, seating, and so on, and then you're immediately beginning to think, well, we could also then do this and get more life into it, and so on and so on. At this point, then you can start seeing, well, this is interesting. So now we have, previously in terms of resilience, as Lars was saying, it was as resilient as a car park, because that's kind of all it was. That street was really a car park. Remember where I started? It looked like this. There's not a person in that street, really. It's just kind of cars ticking hot in the sun. Now with this, so now we have increased stormwater mitigation. We've reduced heat island effect. There are people moving around more. The air is cleaner. The business rates have gone up if you want them to. Your property rates have gone up if you want them to, because greener places are worth more and so on. It's multiple activities, multiple outcomes, multiple things, cross-silo. It's transport and planning and business all simultaneously, and health. So we've gone from that to that, in a way. The issue is, as you know, you can't just do that. You can't just, if I go from this to this, people in Melbourne will kill me. I mean, they almost literally. It's like a human right to park my car there. It's not, but implicitly that's what it's become. So this step-by-step approach is like an adaptive strategy. Sorry for the text changes, but so we've gone bit by bit. That means we can pivot our way through it. If the autonomous shuttle doesn't work, we stop the autonomous shuttle and we try something else. We try e-bike sharing instead, or something. It lets us do this adapting strategy. The cheap stuff is here. The more expensive stuff is at the end. But by the time you get to that point, you've actually started to generate the revenue that will pay for that bit. So it enables you to start right away. You start with action, not planning in a sense. Of course, there's a bit of planning and decision making. But you're starting to change the thing right away from day one, actually, even in subtle, small steps. That means you can take citizens with you on the journey and other stakeholders. Business people in Australia who are in retail business will say, you take the parking away, I'm out of business. That's not true. We've got data from all over the world showing that if you remove the parking, the retail will do better, actually, because people tend to shop on foot at the end of the day. They just don't believe you. You have to show it. So it enables us to start doing these steps. You can then stagger the participation, the engagement, and it gives you a way of holding the outcomes, again, that kind of North Star. We want cleaner, healthier, greener streets, blah, 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 whilst enabling you to wiggle your way towards that future. Every step is a step roughly in that direction, but you might pivot there. That's very different to traditional planning, different to public policy, different to strategy, where you're usually asked to say, tell us exactly what you're going to be doing, how much is that going to cost, what results it's going to deliver year 1, year 2, year 3. And we're saying, well, actually, hold the outcome, and we don't know about the means, but this is a strategy to get you there. It's completely different in that sense. What that kind of looks like in action, I think the Oslo bike sharing scheme is a very good example of this iterative approach. This is not what every day in Oslo looks like, as many of you know, but occasionally it's like this in Oslo. But their bike sharing scheme is a fantastic implementation of bike sharing at a basic level. It's a super good job from an interaction and product design point of view. Importantly, they build in this relationship with the city, so it's called Oslo Bicycle. So it means it's like it's your bikes. If you live in Oslo, then it's the Oslo bikes. In London, the bike sharing scheme is called Santander Cycles, because it's sponsored by Santander, the Spanish bank. So what's my relationship with that if I'm still living in London? Not much. I don't know. If the bike falls over, they can solve it because it's Santander's problem. They're a big bank. Here, their maintenance costs are lower than typical because I think they're creating a link with the city and the bikes. They're saying, they're my bikes, I'm going to look after them in some way. So they work through this really beautifully. They share the data openly with the city, so the city can use it for planning and in real time. They paint the most common Norwegian names on the bike, so when people ride a bike with their name on it, they post to Instagram. This is all kind of creating a link. Finally, for full kind of Nordic brownie points, their maintenance crew are recently released prisoners. So they train prisoners in jail, and when they're released, they go straight into the maintenance crew, so they're going straight into the streets, creating a very public link with the city and the public outcomes again. Solves a problem from the operator side, they need a maintenance crew, but why not also solve a societal problem, if you like, in this sense as well? That further reinforces this link between city, citizen, and service. So it works for the citizen, it works for the service, it works for the city simultaneously. It's floating and fixed. It's public and private simultaneously. It's a private operator running as part of the public transport system. It's doing all of these three modes at the same time. So finally, I'll just close by saying the work that we need to do with cities, this is work I did in my previous life, if you like, with municipal design teams, is beginning to understand how do we put these things together in different ways. The Melbourne example I showed is, how are those things managed in different ways? How do we plan and act differently? What are the outcomes of those things? This is a chunk of Stockholm. It doesn't really matter what it looks like. Maybe what's more important was when we did the work with Stockholm Stad, and they said, what's the city-making team? It wasn't just architects and engineers, with all due respect to architects and engineers. It was with many other disciplines involved. And Stockholm Stad aren't here yet in terms of this being a city-making team, but opening up the conversation in this way, you started thinking, actually, we need multiple perspectives around this thing, because, again, it's not just tech, it's also social. So 2 seconds or so and then I'm done. But this systems-based way of thinking, understanding that cars look, actually from a system point of view, like this. They don't just look like, how do we shift David's car? It's actually, it's a massively complex problem. It's something we're now going to start working on at Vinnova. And the nice thing about complex systems is that you need to find acupunctures. You don't have to try to change the whole system in one go. That's quite hard. Actually, almost impossible. But you can find the acupuncture points and they would ripple through the system. So we'll do something around preventative health, for instance. And that might involve, if we just change the food that's being served in kindergarten, schools and colleges, that will have massive ripple effects through all of those kids growing up, through the systems of procurement that enable that, through the supply chains that feed into those things. And that's a huge thing within Sweden. It's also a food outcome as well as a health outcome. It also relates to where do we plant food and how do we grow food? How do we move things around? So we have all of these missions we're now embarking on in this systemic-like way. Viable cities are very much part of this as sort of the urban angle there, working with Thomas and others. And it means this real sense of that we mustn't be afraid of complexity. That is the way that life is. And we have to address it on its own terms. That doesn't mean it's out of control. It doesn't mean we can't do anything. We're helpless in the face of these things. It means we just have to address it as a complex system, which means finding the acupunctures, to the point earlier, and understanding that, this is a bit of Tokyo. Of course it's a complex system. At the same time, it's a railway line. It's just a railway line, and it's a complex system simultaneously. Hellasgården is a complex system, but it's also just Hellasgården, so we're surrounded by them all the time, and we pretend that they don't exist, and we try to simplify and organize in a very traditional way. It doesn't work. So just to finish, there's a kind of humility involved in working this way, therefore, because it's not command and control, plan and predict language. And I really like this quote from Gautam Bhan, who's an Indian writer, who was writing about the failure of the Indian smart cities movement. And like every smart cities movement, it's a failure. Things are also happening in cities to do with tech simultaneously. So smart cities is both here and not here, depending on your point of view. He would say that the failure of that has been this kind of Grand Projet-style massive infrastructure upgrade. In reality, if you look at what's happening in India, there's incredible smartness on the ground about the way things work. But it's in the, as he puts it, the survival of the ordinary and the everyday, the survival of citizens over cities, and the infrastructures of everyday dignity, the bazaar or the market over the mall, the shared auto over the expressway. So those complex systems are all around us. They provide clues as to move forward, as they do with the Melbourne example. Start small and iterate. You could have a massive impact on the street in the end. So my final thought is borrowing from Gautam basically directly. Let's design infrastructures of everyday dignity and everyday complexity at the same time. Thank you.